Hi Retronauts, welcome back to the channel, and today we are going to be continuing on with the topic of the Sidekick64. That is a cartridge project. This is what you can see here, and in the last video we looked at exactly what you could do with it. I didn't want to dwell too much upon how I made it, but I did want to show you exactly what it could do before we got into the nitty-gritty of how I made it. I thought it was interesting how I made it and how you might tackle a project like this as well. So that's what we're going to do in this video. So let's get on with it and have a look at that right now. So the Sidekick64, why did I decide to do a video on this particular project? Well, a couple of years ago now, I think it was, PCB discussed with me doing a small sponsorship piece on their shared project service. And I wasn't aware of that service until they mentioned it to me. And I thought it was actually really cool. It's quite nice because you can either have only PCBs made, or if you upload a BOM, or if the project already has a BOM on it, BOM meaning bill of materials, you can get PCBWay to actually assemble the project for you. You can either do some of it or all of it. It depends basically what's in the BOM. So I thought that was interesting, and I did a little bit of digging around in that service. I went up to the website, clicked on shared projects, and did some research into Amiga projects and Commodore 64, etc., etc. And one of the projects that came up was the Sidekick64, and I thought it was really cool. Did a bit of research on it, went to the GitHub page and had a read of all the features, was kind of blown away by how much it could do. So yeah, I took a look at my budget and I realized I could get 11 boards made. So let me just show you those. I've got 5 blank boards, and I also got 6 assembled. So let me show you that. This is one of the boards that was assembled. Currently, it has the screen in a temporary position. PCBWay did actually solder that raised, but for it to fit in the case that I designed, and also the case which is available online, it's linked to in that GitHub project. I found that I had to lower the screen. So right now that's in a temporary position. I've got to be careful that I don't drop that out of there. When it was received, it didn't have the Raspberry Pi header, so I soldered that on myself. That wasn't a big thing to do, but most of the heavy lifting, soldering on of all of the small components and the chips, was already done by PCBWay. And I think with my budget of about $150, I got 6 of the boards pre-assembled using the BOM, which is supplied with the project. And I had another 5 boards all within that budget. Now, I must say that was a couple of years ago. So don't, hop along to PCBWay right now and expect those prices. The price of chips and services obviously fluctuate, and there's been a lot of inflation since then. So you can imagine you're not going to get that price these days. However, you can see by that price that it was actually quite affordable. Obviously, you could get together with your friends and get a batch made, and then you could obviously all share that project. Now, along the way, I also set myself a little bit of a task. Number one, to buy a 3D printer, because there is actually a case for it. This is the case. This was already pre-existing when I found the project. So this case has been available for a couple of years. It wasn't produced by the author of the Sidekick64 itself, but somebody else, and that is actually linked to. So kudos to that person for making this case, because it's actually really cool. It's nicely designed. But I thought to myself, wouldn't it be really cool if I could actually design my own case? And so yeah, I set myself that as a target, and then time passed and a number of things happened in my life. I had to spend a lot of money on a couple of different things in my home. Then I got the cabin built, and that cost an arm and a leg, as you can imagine. And the idea of buying a 3D printer had to be put back. Then in Christmas 2025, a couple of things changed personally, financially, which meant I could take the brakes off spending a little bit. I didn't have a lot of money, but I did have enough money to buy a 3D printer. So I got myself a Bamboo 2 HD, and that is actually over there. And I have been learning how to use it ever since then. I did actually take a holiday to Brazil. I have family over there, and we haven't seen them for a while, so me and my wife, we made a trip to Brazil to see my family, and that was really great. But I don't speak Portuguese, unfortunately. I'm not good at languages, and I definitely don't speak Portuguese fluently. So in the time when my wife was having a chat with her in-laws, I would sneak off to my Mac Mini, which I took with me, and I would learn Autodesk Fusion. So I downloaded this cartridge, and I loaded that up into Fusion, and I set myself the task of redesigning it, or rather creating a new cartridge design based on this, because I knew that there was gold in this. There were some features of this cartridge that it would have been really, really stupid to ignore. You know, the way things fit into it, fit around the combination of both the cartridge here and with the Raspberry Pi fitted in. So what we're going to do today is we're going to run through the process of how I made the cartridge, how then it all fits together, and how you can actually make this project yourself. Anyway, let's not dally about any further. We're going to go over to my Mac OS machine over there, and I'm going to show you the cartridge design and the process that I took to actually produce this new case design. Actually, a quick change of plans. What we're going to do is, before we go over to my Mac OS machine, we'll have a look at actually what I received and, you know, what you would receive if you did an order yourself. And then, you know, the ramifications of the way the PCB way carried out what was in the BOM, how I then adjusted that to make it work with what I wanted to do with my particular case design, the original case design, etc., etc. So let's do that. So I received the package like this. It's got grease marks on it. I don't know where they've come from, to be honest, but like I said, this has been hanging around inside my cabin for about going on for 2 years now, I think. Everything came in anti-static bags like this. So for example, in here, you've actually got one of the cartridges. There we go. I'll pop that back in. These have all been modified slightly from the state that they were in when I received them, and I'll explain why. Let's pop that back in the box, actually. There we go. Okay, so what I received, as I said earlier, was 5 anti-static bags with assembled cartridges like this. The screen originally was not like this. I'll talk about that in a second. And I also received in another anti-static bag another 5 of these. So the reason for this is that I started off with the premise, let's see how many fully assembled boards I could afford, and I did that, and I found then I had a little bit of budget left over in my $150 budget, and I used that up by actually getting these boards made as well. Not sure if I'm going to actually put these together myself. I think now, in hindsight, what I should have done is asked for PCBWay to have done a stencil for me for this as well. And I may actually still go ahead and ask for that. Possibly what I could do is get a second batch of these done if people are interested in buying these off me. And then I could obviously have a crack at soldering these. The only issue with that is then I'd have to go through the same process as PCBWay and get all the chips and other bits and bobs for the BOM. That's relatively easy for them because they're an electronics company, basically. Not so easy for me. So I would obviously have to try and find all the parts. And that can be quite a substantial amount of work, actually. That's why it was really quite attractive to me to actually get PCBWay to do that work, you know, because they can go to their suppliers, get the parts, and that's all, you know, that is actually extra work, and it's not trivial. So you've got to bear that in mind when you order these. If you do want to go ahead and just order the boards, just make sure that you're aware of the amount of work it will take to actually get the items on the BOM. So I've got 5 of these, and I've got 6 of these. So let's talk about the problems when these arrived. Now, I say they're problems from my perspective. These were all supplied to spec. There was a BOM, and PCBWay went ahead and carried out what was on the BOM. When I received it, though, I found there were a couple of problems, at least from my viewpoint. So number one was that the screen was too high. Let me show you what PCBWay had done. They had soldered on this riser, this jumper riser, as you can see here. And then what they did was, obviously, they then had this inserted, and then the PCB riser was then obviously soldered into place. That gives you a screen height of about that much. And the best thing to do is, if I put on the original case, the best way to do that is, let me just put this through here. You might struggle to see this, and I might actually struggle to demo it. Yeah, I am. I'm going to struggle to demo it. Basically, what happens is the screen is too high and you can't actually put the case on. It's actually impossible. So I then bit my lip and thought, okay, well, what am I going to do? And the answer was I unsoldered all of these risers, and they had to be junked. Generally, each one of them was junked because one of the pins on here is ground, and it was quite hard to get it out. I got it out without actually causing any damage to the board, but in each case, these pins came out. And in the middle of this process, I thought maybe I needed to order some different size risers, and I ordered the smallest ones I could find from China, a packet of those, whilst I was still working on the case design. And when they turned up, they actually turned out to be exactly the same size as the ones which were originally there. So actually, there's the bag. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do with these now, but I've got a few of them anyway if I do need them. So how did I fix the problem of getting the screen to the right height? Well, what I did was, and you can actually see that here, the solution. I'm not sure if you can see it, but you see there's a couple of little vertical things there. Those are little stands that I made to allow the screen to sort of stand up like a table. And this is a couple of them here. They're pretty small. Took a bit of fiddling around to get these right. They're actually printed out of PETG, transparent PETG, or I would rather say sort of translucent PETG. The reason why I use PETG is because obviously it's stronger and it's a little bit, yeah, it's just more robust basically. And I designed it so that the top part here has a little clip on it to clip over the screen. So let me show you that. Hopefully I could be able to do that here. Maybe a little bit fiddly to do on camera. Let's try. So hook it over one side and then press it over the other. There you go. Hopefully you heard a little click when it did that. And as you can see, it hangs on nicely and you can position it exactly where you want it to be. And you've got to make sure that it doesn't actually go over the pins here from the Raspberry Pi header. And then you can place another one there. It is necessary because when you're placing this into the holes, you want this to make like a little table. So you can basically just rest it in the holes and you know then it's at exactly the right height. So as I will have to solder this at some point, let me put it on here. And there we are, that's clipped on. And I left little gaps at the top of the design so that it doesn't interfere with any of the resistors on the board. So there are actually some resistors on the bottom of this board here. So yeah, it was a little finicky little design, but I got it pretty much nailed in the end. As you can see, it clips on quite nicely. And I'll have to release these when I release my case design. So there you go. It now fits into the slot. And as long as you hold that in position, you can flip it over and you can solder that. And it is exactly the right height to fit in the case. So that was quite a nice little solution in the end. So that was one issue. Another issue was that in the original case design, so let me show that to you here. This was done by a guy called Bigby. Not sure what his real name is, but I assume his surname is Bigby. This design has two LEDs that actually stick out of the case. And I've got one of the LEDs here. I think it's a 3.5 mil, I think, LED. Smaller than the sort of ones you would have in a 64. That's a 5 mil. And obviously it has to project upwards from the surface and then pops through the hole there. There we are, and pops out the top of the case. Now, one issue I had was there wasn't really much ability to talk to the author of this project. That was a little bit frustrating, to be honest, because I wanted to ask what these LEDs represent. I did get somebody on a forum who told me what they meant, but they also said that they are reprogrammable. So I decided that because I didn't really know what they were for, and as there are 4 of them, and I'm not really sure why only 2 of them were exposed in this design, that I would err on the side of caution and go for all 4 LEDs being displayed. So from PCBWay, these little items here are little LEDs, and they do actually work. And what I did was I bought a few different colors of LEDs, green, red and blue, because I thought maybe one of the LEDs represents some kind of error state and the other one represents something else. And I thought maybe color coding would be an idea. I did actually try using these. Obviously you have to solder them in like this. There we go. And you have to get them at the right height. And I found the best way of doing this is to actually put it into the final case. So I've got the final case here. Put this into the case like this. Get the LEDs sitting at the right height here, put them through here, and then you know that they're exactly the right height, and you can then solder those in place and then trim them off after when you're finished. So that's a little bit of a fiddle, but once you've got the technique, it's actually not too bad. I did find that when I tried out the different LEDs that I could only get any joy out of the red ones. I think that maybe because either the power was too much or too little. If it was too little, I'm not going to be able to change that. And if it was too much, it would mean that I would have to have some kind of inline resistor. Space is very tight here. And I just decided that I would just bravely run away from the problem. Well, actually, to be fair, the Commodore 64 does have a red LED. So to keep it OG, I decided to just stick with red LEDs in this particular case. So yeah, you do have 4 LEDs in a row coming out from the port on the case. Oh yeah, going back to the screen, actually, there's one thing else I would like to point out to you. Do you see there are two little pads here? These are called solder pads. These are actually meant to be soldered based on the polarity of your screen, which way round power is or ground is. So if you actually look at these little screens here, I'll show you that. The leftmost pin is ground and the pin to the right of it is VCC. VCC is the power supply. So that means this pad has to be soldered with ground. So that would be the two left pads would need to be soldered together. And then VCC is the two right pads over here. So you would solder those together. And I've read online that people have got these. They've had the screen soldered in place. So yeah, that's something that you have to be aware of, that you have to make sure that you can actually set those. If this was soldered in directly from the factory, that would be a problem. You would then have to definitely unsolder this so you can get to these. So that's definitely something you need to do before you assemble it. You've got to make sure that these pads are soldered correctly. When you actually order it, you can choose to have one screen or another. I think in the BOM that I selected, I think it had this particular screen as the type. There is actually an OLED screen, which sounds more attractive, but it looks like it might be actually a little bit more limited. The author of this project actually recommends that you use this type of screen. So I went with his recommendation, and these are the screens that I received. So yeah, you've got those pads and you've got to make sure that they are actually soldered correctly. Another thing that I chose to do was, and again, this is something that I have to do when the screen is not installed, and that is I decided to install some LEDs under here. So I ordered a couple of different types of LED. They were meant to be bright blue. There was one LED which actually is blue, you know, it physically looks blue, and then there was another one which is clear. But I tested both, and actually both of them glow quite blue. But I thought that maybe the clear one would actually be more luminous. So I've gone with that particular one. And what I do is I cut the LEDs quite short like that. I splay the legs out, and then I solder its pins to, let me see, this would be ground, I think. So ground would go here, and then VCC would go there. And then, and this is where it gets really finicky, I decided it wasn't bright enough. So I actually soldered in two. They do actually fit under the screen, so that's perfectly fine. And it's those LEDs that actually give the case its blue glow. I did actually want it to be in that position. I did actually look over the rest of the board where I could actually solder something. I could have soldered something on the top here, I guess. But the problem with that is then you would actually physically see the LED inside the case. And I find that it's better if it's diffused, because I used to work in lighting in movies, and yeah, I think when you see a light directly with your eyes, it's not an attractive thing. And I think it would have been just overpowering if it was, say, somewhere around here. Not sure if you have any power around here. Looks like you maybe have ground maybe, but yeah, I decided that it was much better that it was hidden underneath the screen, which would then let the light leak out around it and then create more of a diffuse blue lighting. So when it came from PCBWay, another thing that was omitted was the headers. I then ordered some of those. I think they were from Amazon. You could possibly add them to the BOM or ask them to add them to the BOM. They do need to be there, I think, as far as I understand it. There's no other way you could actually put this together. So yeah, they just need to be soldered on. That was quite easy. Basically, I just put the header on like that. I think I held it with a bit of blue tack, and I made sure that I used something like a pen or something like that to prop it up like that. And then I tack one pin, tack another pin at the other end, and then slowly go along and make sure that you solder all those heads on. And that's basically it. It's then ready to go, at least for my purposes. There was one other thing I noticed, and I think I should mention it before we finish off in this little section, and that is that Bigby, in his case design, actually created these spacers. And I wondered what they were for at first, but then I very quickly realized that when you put it together, the Raspberry Pi is effectively floating here, and there's a bit of stress between here. You don't really want that. So what you want is some kind of spacer like that, you see, that goes in between the Raspberry Pi. So you can see that he's obviously measured that distance and created those. In my particular design, they can be opaque. They don't have to be transparent because no light is going to get there and go through them anyway. So I've just gone with opaque light gray PLA for these. So obviously I need to print out 2 of these for every one of the cases as well. So that's obviously something that has to be done. Okay, that out of the way, what about the actual case design? Well, as I said, I set myself the goal of designing a new case. Let's look at the original one by Bigby. This is not the only design out there. This is just the one that I chose to base my design on. And obviously it had to be a case that fit the Raspberry Pi 3B. So there weren't really that many options. So I used this one. And to be fair to Bigby, it's a really nice design. I really like it. Having said that, whenever I set out to do a project where, you know, I've got this idea of, in quotes, improving on it, you have to write down some criteria about what is an actual improvement. Otherwise, I mean, yeah, just stick with what you got, right? So one of the things I didn't like about the design, and that's to do with the styling of the Commodore 64, is the Commodore 64 is not angular. it is a rounded design. I'm basing my aesthetic on the bread bin in particular. It's a very rounded design. I think it was probably one of the most rounded designs of that era. Relatively unusual. There were quite a lot of angular designs, especially if you think about the heritage of the Commodore company. You got the PET, which was originally incredibly angular. So what he's done here is he's used 45-degree angles here. There's a 45-degree angle there. Hopefully you can see that. It's where the projection, where the cartridge plugs into the machine. There's a 45-degree angle there, as I said. And all of the edges here, they're all beveled in a linear way with a bevel that goes all the way around like that. Also, if you look at the profile of the edges of the case, it's slightly angular as well. Hopefully you can see that there. There's a line and then another line. So the first goal that I set myself was that I was going to round everything and try and make it much more reminiscent of an actual Commodore 64 bread bin case. So if you look at my design, you'll see here I've tried to make this more rounded. This is actually a curve here where the two parts join together. This edge is rounded. Not necessarily that easy to print because a 3D printer obviously prints in layers, and that means if you have a very gentle curve, unless it's printing at quite a high density, you're not going to get a very good resolution of that. So I had to print this at quite a thin layer height. I think it was 0.1. Another thing that I wanted to get better was the ventilation slats. You can see that Big B has done that here. He's got ventilation slats. I had a look at the original ones, and these are noticeably thinner. And also what I noticed was that there are more of them than there are on the actual 64. So I've matched the count here. I think it's like 6, isn't it? 6 vent slots. I know this may seem a bit anal, but if you're trying to match something, you've got to match it, right? So that's what I was trying to do. And then what I also did was, and this is where it's getting a bit anal, if you look at his design, it wraps around the edge and you've got these vents here. And what I decided to do with my design was to try and match the original style of the Commodore 64 as the vent slots wrap over the edge. And I've done a pretty decent job here getting the curvature very, very similar to the original design. Because I lost these slats here, these vent holes to let cool air in at the bottom, what I did was, it's a little bit of a hidden feature actually, I added a row of ventilation slots here. So we actually let cool air in this direction rather than letting it in from the side. What I quite like about this as well is that it does actually hide that feature. It's not necessarily something that was there on the original 64. These are also curved as well. I've kept the kind of curved apertures in play. So I've tried to keep it to this kind of curved aesthetic as much as possible. So that's something which I think came out reasonably well in the end. You can see here that he's got 2 LED holes. As I said, in my design, I've gone for 4. And that's because I basically didn't really know what they were for. So I thought, you know what? I don't really see the point of hiding status lights. Let's just have them all out there blinking away. And I actually really like it, actually, the way it came out. It's really quite cool when they come on. And yeah, you're definitely going to be able to see what's going on. What else? Yeah, on the ends here, the original holes here, which let out the buttons, and then the power supply for the Pi, the HDMI for the Pi, and the sound port for the Pi, the 3.5mm jack. What I did with mine was I added little trims around them. So they looked like they were intentional. I personally felt these looked a little bit like, how can I put it this way? I think on a design, you wouldn't necessarily have it like that. In industrial design, these have got little lips around them, which just make them look a little bit more like they were intended. Another thing as well, which I changed, and this was more for my convenience, is that in the original case, you can see that there are slots here. Hopefully you can see that. That's where a bolt is meant to be pushed in, so that when you then put the screws through to hold the case together, it then slides into that bolt, and that's how you hold it together. What I've done in my design is that, let me just open this up. I've changed it from bolts to metal inserts. So those are inserted using a soldering iron. It's quite finicky, actually. Got to be very careful how you do it. But I think it gives a better result, possibly a little bit stronger. But it's more to do with learning doing this process as well. I've seen other people use these inserts, and I thought they were pretty cool. And I thought I would give that a go. Oh yeah, another design cue was the surround of the LEDs. This is relatively subtle, and I'll explain why it came out like this. On the original Commodore 64, there's a lozenge that goes around the LED. It's famous. If you have a Commodore 64, you know what I'm talking about. That particular little lozenge that goes around the Commodore 64 actually sticks out of the case. And I did a print of one of the prototypes of this originally where I did that. But what it meant was I had to have the entire underside of the case. So the case prints like that. That's the most logical way to print it. And you have to raise it off the print bed, and you have to put a raft of material underneath just to have that come out by, let's say, 1mm. And all that material then has to be thrown away. So what I thought was maybe it would make more sense that I have it going inwards instead of outwards. And that would then have the side effect of also meaning that more of the LED was exposed. You wouldn't just see the tip of it, because in the original design, you actually don't really see that much of the LED that pokes through. And in my design, you get to see about another millimeter or so of it. So I thought that looked a little bit more attractive. In Bigby's design, he actually has an inset here where you're meant to put a paper label. And I thought it would be really quite interesting if I followed that idea. Also, Lee, you may have watched my video recently where me and Lee talked about, possibly working on a monitor project in the future. We'll have to see how that goes. But Lee also suggested that as an idea. He said, why don't you print out your logos and all the other stuff as separate elements and then put them into insets? And having seen this, I thought, that's quite a decent idea. It's more work, to be fair, but I thought it was worth a try. Let me show you here an earlier prototype. This was actually printed out of PETG, and it has an interesting difference. This would probably be the better solution to go for in terms of strength and durability and all that kind of stuff. But the problem I found with PETG was that, hopefully you can see that, it's much, much more opaque than the PLA that I managed to find. And, I wanted it to be transparent, and I wasn't getting the transparency that I wanted. And to accentuate that transparency, I actually used a sparse infill with a hexagonal pattern. And I think that came out looking really cool. I tried it as an experiment. There are different patterns that you can use in Bamboo Slicer, but this was the one that I decided to stick with. And I then actually thinned out the case a little bit by making the outer walls a little bit thinner. It's still perfectly robust, but it allows that sort of honeycomb pattern to really shine through. And I think it looks really cool. So yeah, unfortunately, in the end, the PETG cases were not used. This particular one is interesting because it obviously doesn't have the inset yet on the front. I hadn't started working on that. You can see the lozenge here a lot more clearly on this particular case. And also what's quite nice about it is that you do see the slats here much more clearly, because basically the case is becoming more opaque, closer to being just white, I suppose. And therefore you can see the form of the object much more clearly. On the back of this, I did actually do, this was like almost like an engraving of the Retronaut helmet that you see in the title sequence for this channel. And I put the Retronaut logo here. And this was just an experiment. And the helmet actually came out pretty good. But the problem is that the text here had to be so small that the assembled by text that I wanted to put here, because, like I said earlier, I don't want to take credit for this project. I do want to take credit for just assembling this particular cartridge. I just couldn't get that to print. That was too small and it couldn't resolve on a 3D printer. So what I decided to do in the end was to compromise and instead switch to just using the Retronaut logo and increasing this text so that it could render reasonably well. And I actually think the result in the end looks pretty cool. Obviously then with these insets in place, and actually this PETG prototype here actually shows you what the inset looks like. So there we go. Hopefully you can see that on camera. So yeah, that inset then has the logo pushed into it. And it's actually so tight that it just sort of clips in. But what I do is I obviously then glue it in place as well. And then that gives some extra strength to that area. It replaces the plastic that we've removed. But to be fair, it's still actually pretty robust. But yeah, the plastic inserts make that much more robust once it's actually glued in place. On the front side, the logos, I did a similar thing. This was actually much more work actually, because this text here was really difficult to get to print out to be legible. I had to do a lot of revision with this. And later on in this video, I'll show how I made these insets. So hopefully that's enough information about the cartridge and all the changes that I made. I think what we'll do now is we will actually go over to my Mac and we'll take a look at how I modeled this. Okay, so here we are in Fusion, and this is the model that I showed you earlier. We saw a 3D print of it made by Bigby. I found this via the GitHub page. And as I said, there are a number of features on this that we really wanted to maintain going forward. So let me just highlight what they are. First of all, we've got the aperture where the cartridge goes through, the actual PCB board. You can see that Bigby has put in some supports here that hold it in place. We need to make sure that we do that. We get that exactly right. So that's held in exactly the right position. On the right-hand side of the case, we've got a little aperture here where the micro SD card goes through. We're going to make sure we match that really well, because I'm sure Bigby must have agonized over that a lot. On the rear of the case, we've got the 3 holes for the buttons. And then down here, we've got the holes for the power supply, for the HDMI, and for the 3.5mm audio jack. And then over here, you've got the Raspberry Pis, Ethernet, and USBs. I don't think they're used actually in this project, but maybe that was something that the author was thinking about addressing at some point. It would be quite nice actually if it did have some kind of USB capability. But anyway, yeah, that's not really a feature right now. On the top of the case, we've got an aperture here where you access the power jumper. To the right of it, you've got a square where you've got the screen. So that has to be all matched perfectly. Got the two holes at the top where we've got the LEDs. And we've got to make sure that not only do we match these holes, but we also take into account the spacing, because we obviously need to add in the other two LEDs as well, holes for them. Which I actually added later. Originally, I was thinking about matching this, but eventually I did go for the 4. Then we've got here the two holes for the two different sets of jumpers. In my design, I actually did close this here. This bugged me a bit. I don't know why. Even though they are very close together, I decided I didn't really want them to become one hole. So I actually did put some plastic in there, which was strong enough to actually survive the print, that is, more than anything. And then this hole here, we need to make sure that this is here, because this is where the jumpers attach to the wires that go into the Sidekick64 to allow it access to the CPU and the SID. So I think that's about it. As I said, the vents at the top, I thought they were a little bit inaccurate, so we're going to rework those. The bevels that he's used here, we're going to rework that as well. I'm going to try and make the curvature on this a little bit different. So how did I start modeling this? Well, if I show you an object, you'll get a bit of an idea of what I did. So it's a little bit like modeling with clay. You throw down a big piece of clay and then you reduce from it and then you add to it and things like that. It's a very similar process, actually, even though it's virtualized. It's still very similar in the way that we approach it. I guess, you know, as humans, we're used to that kind of model of making things subtractively and additively working. As I said, with clay, it's very, very similar. Now, obviously, you can see that what I've done is I've used a shape. So pretty much everything in Fusion is made with shapes. So if I go down here, there's a lot of objects in this scene, I must admit. There's actually a folder down here called Sketches. There it is. If we open that up, in here, there are loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of shapes. So I think we've got, let's have a look, these two here. If I show you these, probably recognize what that is. Now, we'll be having a look at this later, so I won't dwell on this, but that's an example of a shape that you can then take and turn into something else. And like I said, I've got loads and loads and loads of these. Yeah, I mean, there you are. There's some kind of random rectangle that was used at some point to do some kind of Boolean or something like that. So if I were to look through here, this whole bunch of sketches, somewhere in there would be a shape that was probably used originally to do an extrusion, which gave you this shape, which then meant I could cut into the backside of the overall shape to give you that portal where the PCB can actually then go and fit through as it goes into the back of the Commodore 64. If you look at this shape, it's not just a simple cube. Originally it was. I agonized over that. I remember doing that, just making sure that it was exactly the right size so it fit inside the cavity of the original case and matched it to make sure that the walls of the case, you know, were exactly the right size. So in this case, the cube was moved until it was like exactly on the outside of the case. So let me just show you that. Yeah, so if I show the top, sorry, this top and the bottom, there we are. So you can see that that gray shape is just inside. It actually does stick out there, obviously, because we haven't done anything there yet. It fits in here at the back, goes to here exactly where we want it to be. And yeah, you can see it basically fills out pretty perfectly the volume of the original design by Bigby. It is curved. That was again done with shapes. I made shapes that were exactly that curvature. Then I extruded them and then cut them off the side. Did the same thing in this direction, same thing in that direction, until you have this curved sided object. I did actually notice that when it was printed out, it looks like it might be linear because of the way the two parts of the case join together as a kind of clamshell. But it is actually curved. It's just that that's the way it came out when it was printed. It looked like that there was a sort of line here. But yeah, it's actually an actual curve. So that's the first part of the model. Then we obviously had to have the back part. So I've got that here as well. So there it is. That's the original version of it, as you can see. I think what I then did was I created a shape that sat inside that and then allow me to Boolean that out, which we saw a little bit earlier. So if I show you the second version of this, you can see we've got that shape cut out from the inside. So that is basically an extrusion with exactly the shape that you can see here. That's been extruded. Actually, let me just show you an extrusion because I keep on talking about that, but I just wanted to see what I mean by that. So let's create a shape. When you create a shape, you have to choose a plane that it's going to go on. So let's say on that plane. So we're now looking at it from the view of the Commodore 64. So let's say I wanted to make a cutout of this. I can make, say, for instance, a rectangle. and I can go here, and you can edit this to your heart's content. It's got really nice tools for doing curves and things like that. In this case, we're just going to do a very simple rectangle. When you're happy with it, you just say finish the sketch, and now it's ready to be used. And it's a 3D object in space. Obviously, it's got no thickness. It's over here. You can't move shapes. You have to make an extrusion of make an object from it, and then you can move the object. But as far as I'm aware, you can't really move the shape itself. But you don't need to do that. You can select that shape, and then up here you see you've got the extrude tool, and then you can choose to give it some depth. And when you OK that, I believe that shape would have been possibly deleted. But basically now we have an object, and we can select this object. So we'll go like that, and now I can move it down here. And I could do something with it. You know, like I said, if I made this, I could then cut this out of here, use it as a tool. And it's quite nice the way that Fusion works. When you cut things with one object with another, you can either choose to keep the original object, the tool, I should say, that you did the cutting with, or you can choose to get rid of it, just lose it. So there we go. We've got the main body of the cartridge, and we've got the slot moving along, and you can get an idea now of the way it kind of works in Fusion. The next thing I needed to do was to cut out the inside of this case. And to do that, I made this pretty complicated little object, which is, as you can see, a bool main body. This is meant to be a cutting tool. And to make this, you can probably think what I did. I made this cube that I then scaled to fit, you know, exactly inside the body of the original design. So if I just show you that, there we are. So yeah, you can see these cubes fit perfectly. You know, I would zoom right in and make the shape exactly the right size. And then when I was happy with that, I would then extrude it to make these cubes. And as you can see, they all fit into their various positions perfectly. Here, I put circles, obviously, to match the original design. The same on the top as well for the LED holes. And then these here were, as you can see, like that. They just basically then pop out through the side of the case. Then you've got a cube here that cuts out the side of the case there. And once you got that, you were then ready to then cut that out of the body. So there's the main body. Actually, it's not that one, is it? It's this one here, sorry. There's the main body. If we hide the Boolean, we want to cut that out to the inside. So what we do is we select the main body, we select the tool that we want to use to do the cutting, and then we say modify. And for Booleans, you've got three types of Booleans. You can either combine objects together, that's called a join. Then you've got a cut where you take one object and you cut the other object away using that. And then obviously you've got intersection where two objects intersect. You can keep the part that intersects and lose the rest of it. In this case, it's a cut. You can choose to keep the tool like I just said. In this case, we'll lose it for now. I'll use an undo actually to bring it back. So, you know, it's useful to have it for future reference. So I'll just say okay. And there you go. Pretty quickly, you've got the makings of a cartridge. You've now got the main body of the cartridge, and all of the main apertures are cut out really accurately from the main body of the cartridge. If I combine that with the slot B, yeah, now you're really starting to see how it starts to come together. So let's undo those operations. We've got our tool back, our bool. We'll just hide that. Let me show you, jumping ahead a little bit. We've got this. You can see I've got three objects here. So as I was working along, I was trying to create a bit of a sort of construction history, which Fusion does actually have, but I started this project without using it, and I just continued in that workflow until the end. So yeah, anyway, this was a test which I did at some point. I've Booleaned out the tool from the main body, and I've got this shape. And then what I've also done is, in this particular version, I've tested out using chamfers. So you've got bevels, which are like 45-degree flat planes on corners, which give it a bit of a curve, you know, in quotes, curvature. Obviously, it's not actually curved, it's a flat plane. But in Fusion, you also have chamfers, which are curved edges to corners. And you can see that it's really nice, does a really nice job there as well. Nice job over here. What I've also done is I've cut out these shapes here. Oh, actually, let me just show you something. For some reason, in this particular version, I didn't actually select these edges here. So let me just show you how you do, oh, it's actually called a fillet actually. There we go. And then you can give it a radius. Let's try 2 millimeters. There we go. And it will actually cut that like that, as you can see. It's amazing. Very, very cool. In this case, it's causing some artifacts. So it would have been better if I actually just selected all of the edges in one go and then do the fillet all at the same time, because then it can actually do the best job of actually filleting everything. These little shapes here, they're interesting because they're the beginnings of the vents. So let me show you what I used to actually cut those out. So there are a couple of shapes down here, bool top vents, and these are complicated little objects. Again, you know, you're creating a rectangle that goes down into the surface. Then you're creating another rectangle that can cut out of there, or you can just draw this all in one go if you're, you know, very careful. I think that's actually what I did. And each one of these was created separately. And then when you look at it from the front, you can see that I've then created this shape and cut it out as well. So it's a fully complex three-dimensional shape that is used to cut into the surface of the main body. So there's the main body. And you can see how these were used to cut into the surface and leave behind these negative shapes that you can see here. And what's really nice about it is that you've got this curvature here on the edge. And that's basically the lowest part of the vent. And then obviously you've got the upper part of the vent. And to fill in that gap, you've got these objects down here called vent strip. So if I show you those, they were obviously pretty complicated to make. I believe I used the curvature that I used to cut out from the original Boolean to get those to match perfectly. And then I created another shape at the top, and I think I extruded that out. And then I filleted the edges to give it these nice curved edges. Eventually, pretty close to the end of actually modeling this, I made rectangles that fitted into the bottom side of here, and they actually go in at an angle, and they cut out the case here to actually create physical holes. So these vents actually do let hot air out of the case. So yeah, there's the vent strips. So let's just hide those. So let's move along to version C of the case. There we are. And yeah, you can see a couple of things have changed here. I did actually do the fillet on the bottom, as I said. I've cut some holes in the bottom of the case which allow the screws to go in. We'll take a look at that a little bit more in a moment. And then underneath here, you can see I've created shapes, which is basically a rectangle with a circle on either end, and then extruded that out and then made an array. So in other words, they were spaced evenly, and then extruded that and then used those objects to cut out a hole in the case. And then once that was done, I then filleted their edges. To give you an idea, I think these are like 0.5 of a millimeter, something like that. These are pretty tiny, these fillets. And one of the things I would say is that as you go along, you've got to be careful that you don't model in detail that your 3D printer can't really resolve, because it's very easy to get carried away with modeling stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you may find that your 3D printer, especially if you're printing at 0.4 millimeters, you know, the nozzle, it may not actually be able to resolve that stuff. But I was aiming to use a 0.2 nozzle with a 0.1 millimeter slice, and that gives you amazing results. It actually looks like it was made in a factory, and I thought it was worth putting in that kind of detail. You'll notice that in the finished design, there are actually more slots. So I did come along later and I thought to myself, you know what, we want to have good airflow, and you can't see under here. So let's actually have these slots go all the way pretty much over here and over here as well. This was problematic in the early version. Let me show you that. Is it this version? I think there was a version. I can't seem to find it now. Yeah, so basically in an earlier version of this, I had a kind of hole there. And by this point, I've actually got rid of a piece of plastic that was still remaining from there. So that's good. So it's moving along. These, at the end of the day, I decided not to do any chamfering or anything like that, or any filleting. Just left these hard edge. I thought they would look better like that. So yeah, these guys, let's have a look. These are literally holes in the bottom of the case. And if you were to try and put a screw in there, it would just fall through the hole. So what you've got down here is a thing called a screw hole base. So let me just show you those in isolation. So these are very much based on the originals in the bottom of the case design, I think. So let me show the bottom. There we are. And you can see, yeah, I've matched these verbatim. They look like they're intersecting because I did try to match it almost perfectly. So that basically is where the screw goes through, and it has an indent in it, which allows the screw to countersink into the bottom of the case so you can't see it. Now, I found that because I decided to use inserts, that was problematic, because the screw had to go a little bit further originally into the case to go into those bolts. Do you remember in the original design, they were meant to be bolts that they went into? And that went below the surface of the posts, which are in the top of the case. Well, when I changed it to inserts, it moved the contact point between the fastener and the screw up by about, I think it was like 3 or 4 millimeters, something like that. And that meant when I was trying to actually tighten the case together, I couldn't do it. I couldn't actually put the screw any further in. So what I did was, to fix that in the end, was I actually grabbed this surface here and I pulled it up, I think by about 4 millimeters. So now the screws don't actually countersink into the cartridge. which isn't a problem because, interestingly, I found that my cartridge was still sagging a little bit, you know, putting a little bit of force, because it's quite heavy. You know, it's got a Raspberry Pi in it and the logic board for the Sidekick. So with the screws actually protruding out a little bit, it actually gives you effectively little feet made of steel. It's not rubber, but it doesn't need to be because it's, you know, it doesn't have to not slide or anything like that. So actually, I decided that in the end it was a feature. So yeah, that's how it goes. Sometimes you got to roll with the punches, right? So there we are. So that's the modified version where, you know, obviously that inset is a lot more shallow. These get booleaned onto the bottom of the actual case and they fill it in the holes. So if I show you the main body again, there they are. And as I said, they fill in the holes. Screw goes through there into the insert, which is up here. And it connects the two parts of the case together really nicely. So at some point, I had to stop fiddling around with this kind of stuff and I had to go, you know, to the next level. So what I did was I had a bit of a process where I kind of booleaned everything together. I was keeping the tools actually, so I didn't lose anything. I kept things for later. And what I ended up with was a couple of objects down here. Yeah, whole cart top and whole cart bottom. So this is actually jumping forward a few steps. So let's have a look at this. This is basically what now gets printed. This is the finished design. And you can see I've combined this part of the cartridge with this part of the cartridge. I've cut holes in here, which, you know, as we saw earlier, that was needed to let the jumpers be worked on. I think I put some kind of chamfer on here. Definitely there's a chamfer on there. And I've done the inset here for the LEDs rather than having it poking out. And obviously I put in the other two holes. So I had to design a new tool to do that, to cut in. And the biggest, probably the most difficult thing actually on this conceptually for me was the technique for how I would actually split this into two parts. Because when I booleaned everything together, the important thing to remember is that this is one solid object at the point where I've done that. And now I need to make it into two separate objects. So originally, obviously, the back part of the case was one part and the front part was the other part. Now it's all just one piece, one solid piece of plastic. And obviously that's of no use because you can't put the Sidekick64 inside. So what I had to do was to split it into two parts, and this was really difficult. And the reason why is that if we look on this side, do you see there's the split line there, and it comes around the corner, then it goes up, and it goes over, and then down, then round, goes over here, around the bottom of the hole there, and over there. If we have a look on the other side of the case, there's the split line coming round, goes through here, goes through the center of here, and it comes over here. So the difficult part of all of that is that you have a line here which is completely flat. It's on a single plane. So if we look at that from the right, and I'll highlight for this for you now so you can see that, that line there is what we need to actually cut through the case, almost like a cheese slicer. You know, one of those cheese wires cutting through some cheese. We need to cut through the entire side of the case and come out the other side with that line so that we can create a clamshell. Except that if we look at the other side of the case, as I just explained, the line doesn't go straight. It goes up like this, over and like that. So how is I going to achieve that? The tool system, the splitting tool in Fusion doesn't support that. You can't have a non-linear split. You have to have basically something that sort of projects through an object as a straight line. It can't go up and down in 3D space as it cuts through an object. I think they should support that. I think they should allow you to model like a polygonal shape that can be used to slice, but they don't. So my solution was then cut the case into two halves along its length. So if I show you from the top, yeah, let me just rotate that. Yeah, so what I did was I created a plane that bisected the entire cartridge from top to bottom. And you can do that in Fusion, it's a tool. And then I used that to then cut the cartridge into two halves, the left-hand side and the right-hand side. Then I had a line over here that was completely linear and a line over here, which was a little bit wriggly. As I said, it goes up and down. And I then used that line over here to cut this part, the left-hand side, into two parts. And I used the other line over here, the straight line, to cut this part into two parts. But the interesting thing is that that line does become coincident at this point here. So you can actually see in the resulting model that there are two separate lines here. And that is an artifact of the fact that I did actually split this into two halves along its vertical length here. It doesn't survive everywhere, but in some places it does here. Where does it survive? There we are. That actually shows you the point where it was cut into two parts. There we are, and it's there as well. Down here? No, it's not here. So it survived for some reason in the mathematics of the way Fusion does all its, magic. Got chopped along here, and then chopped along here and chopped here. So I ended up with 4 parts. So you have left, top and bottom, and right, top and bottom. Once you've got that and you check it over and you're sure that everything's fine, you can then join together the top, left and right sides together to make the top part of the case. And you could do the same thing with the bottom parts. And this is where I found myself. I was really struggling at the point where I did that. I couldn't quite work out how to do it. But at the end of the day, that was the technique that I used and it worked fine. You can see that at some point I've made shapes here. I think these were simply circles with another circle inside. And then what I did was I just did a chamfer. So you can see there's a chamfer there. And I used that same shape 3 times, positioned it exactly right, and then boolean that together so it actually joins together to form one piece. And yeah, it just gives you a little bit of extra detail around those ports. And I think it makes it look like they were really intentional, you know. Let's have a look at the inside of the case, the top part. These were interesting things. These had to be modeled as well. These are, again, based on largely the models that Bigby did in his model, these shapes here. These are the posts where the inserts get put into. You heat them up with a soldering iron, and you actually literally put them into the plastic. It melts the plastic, and then obviously as it cools, it becomes a part of the case. But you've got to be careful. This is the tricky part. You need to put a screw into them as they're cooling and before they've cooled, and then you need to align that screw so it is perfectly vertical. So obviously when you go to put the screw in, it goes into it. Otherwise, if it's misaligned, it's not going to go into it. It's not going to work. So that's a technique that I discovered that I had to do. You've got this here. I'm not sure why he did this, but I just followed it. These 2 little standoffs here, they actually hold the screen in position left to right, so it can't move. And then it's pushed up against here. And as you saw earlier, we've got those little standoffs that hold the screen pushed up against the top of the case so it doesn't move. And inside the case, you can see as well that it is also filleted as well, as you can see there and all the way around. So yeah, quite a lot of work to do this. One of the last things I had to do was put in these cubes here, and these obviously then fit into shapes on the other side of the case, negative shapes, so that the 2 parts of the case lock together really neatly. And again, that was something that Bigby had done, and I learned from that, and I thought, okay, that's pretty cool. So followed the same technique to do that. So there we are. It's basically, this is the finished result. Now then, there is just one more thing I want to show you, and that is the inset here. You'll recognize that from our discussions earlier on the actual physical case. And then if we look on the bottom, you can see on the back, it's got a much more complicated shape here. And that's where the inset goes for the Retronaut logo and for the assemble by text. So what we'll do next is we'll have a quick look at that process, because I think it's quite interesting if you want to do it in your own projects. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how I actually managed to get my logos embedded into the surface neatly. It's a process which involves Photoshop, Adobe Illustrator, and then Fusion. So the first thing I would do is in Fusion, or whatever software you're using, choose an orthographic view, and then do a screen grab of your model that you want to inlay your text, your logo into. In this case, it's the top of the case, and I'm interested in putting it at the top there. So I've done a screen grab of this, and then using Photoshop, you can then overlay your logo once you've got it designed, make sure it's the right size before you then advance to exporting vectors and things like that to try and make 3D objects. But it's a really good way of working because it's an orthographic view, there's no perspective involved. You can see exactly the size of the model, and you can size your object and get it exactly right. And then obviously when you're happy with it, you can then export it as an SVG, bring it into Fusion, etc., etc. So let's have a look at the retro logo. We turn off a couple of the elements here. This was the original logo, as you would have seen in the title sequence for my channel. Now, to put this into a 3D object, especially when it's only going to be about 8 centimeters, 7 centimeters long, something like that, there's too much detail in it. So if you look at on the O, you've got, what will end up being separate objects, right? You've got to remember that every single thing that you have, every little bit of detail that you have will end up as a separate object. So this circle, this square circle here, will end up being one object. This inside it will be another, and this will be another. So just for that O, you end up with that, and this outside here as well, and this. Yeah, it's just too much. So what I tried to do was I tried to simplify it. So this shows you that I've basically used the Photoshop selection tools to select the text, and I've only kept the text. And then over here, you can see that I've kept the wings as well. Kept the wings and the text, and that's it. And then the next thing I've done is, if I turn this on, I've also got the outside. So I selected that as well, and I've made that white. What I'm doing is I'm overlaying it on top of this using additive mode. So you can see there I've done add. This is just completely black in this area. So with add, that will light it up. When you're happy with that, You know, as in this case, I did, you know, a bit of fiddling around to get something that I think is going to work and going to print. What you need to do then is export that as a PNG, because we're going to take that into Illustrator and turn that into a bunch of vectors and save it out as an SVG, which can then be loaded into Fusion. So let me just show you the assembled by design. So assembled by is intended to go on top of that logo on the back of the case. So similar approach, I typed out the text, did the usual Retronaut outline around it. And in this case, this has actually got a little bit too much detail in it. It's got the black outline going around the text and then a white outline. That black outline and the white outline will eventually become one object, and that will be basically in blue, and then the text will be white. And then on top of the case, this is obviously the decal that you see at the top of the case, and it shows you what the buttons are: freeze, alt, option, reset, and menu. And then you've got the Sidekick64 logo. Now, originally, I did want the logo to be bigger than it's ended up being. I have diminished it on purpose. There is a design here. You can see I've created this outline that goes around the entire thing, and I've tried to match the angle, the slight sort of italic angle, which is based on the italic text. So I think that looks pretty nice, and I've managed to get the logo to line up with the outline. Unfortunately, I had to make the text that size, otherwise the 3D printer couldn't print it. I'm using a 0.2 nozzle, and that is just about small enough to resolve this text. It's a little bit blurry, it's not perfect, but it's legible, it's perfectly fine, and I think it's great. But any smaller than this, and it just wouldn't have worked. And the only downside is because of that, it does compete a little bit with the logo, I think, and I would have liked originally the text to be smaller and the logo to be bigger, but to do that, I would have had to use a printed label, which is something I didn't want to do for this particular design. So there we are. You can see I've got these black and white images. Each of these would be exported as a PNG. What I then do, actually, is I load them up again, the PNG itself, and then just crop them a little bit tighter, because the next stage is we're going to bring them into Adobe Illustrator, and we're going to turn them into SVGs. So let's have a quick look at how we do that. Okay, so here we are in Illustrator. There's our Retronaut logo ready to go. Obviously, it's got, you know, if you zoom in on it, it's not wonderful. This is a little bit stepped. That's actually, these are artifacts which are actually coming from the logo, the actual text, the font file. And when Photoshop actually does the outline for you, you get this sort of mirroring of these curves here. I think you can see it there. You know, it's not perfectly curved around that edge there. I don't know why that is, but anyway, it is what it is. So we're going to turn this into an SVG. So we have to go up to Window and open up Image Trace. There we go. Make sure that the image is selected, and then you need to turn on Preview, and it will basically automatically, there we are. Do you see that there? That changed if I zoom in a bit. So yeah, basically now this is being rendered as an SVG. I found you need to experiment with paths. Generally, I found that keeping the paths lower is better, because then it has a tendency to analyze curves like this and make it simpler. Generally, the more simpler curve, the better. It looks more smooth. So, well, it is more smooth. So let's just reduce the number of paths. And you can see Adobe Illustrator does a really good job there of producing a much more smooth curve going on there. So that's really cool. Corners, if you reduce the number of corners, it literally can't render these sharp points. I generally keep that pretty high. It doesn't mean that it is going to add corners. It's just that if it needs to have a sharp corner, it can. It's like a corner budget, basically. And then noise is it just blurs the underlying image, I think, really, to remove any slight irregularities. When you're happy with what you've done, you can fiddle around with these values until you get something that looks good. You just click on Expand, and that will actually turn it into some curves. So there you are, you can see the curves. So this is ready to be exported as an SVG, but we do need to add one more curve, which is, do you see we have this area around here? I call this the inset template. So we're going to make basically 3 conceptual shapes, although it ends up being a lot more than just 3. We want to create the text, which is the white text that you see here, Retronaut, and the wings. Then you have the black area, which I call the surround, and that holds it all together, binds it all together. So it sounds a little bit like I'm talking about the force. Yeah, it's not the force. It's just that you don't want to have the letters just, you know, flapping around. You need something to bind them together, and that's the black area, the surround. And then you need another shape, which is then used to cut, you know, cookie cutter into the surface of the cartridge, and then allow you to inset that plate, that text plate, into the surface and produce a really nice looking result, I think. So to do that, you do need to have a little bit of an offset. So let's select here. I've selected this area outside. I'm going to go to Object, Path, Offset Path. And if I press Tab, so you can see that there's the value. Unfortunately, this doesn't update in real time, which is a bit of a pain, really. Every time you change that, it should really detect that, but it doesn't. You have to press Tab. So if we cancel that and zoom out, the best thing to do is to look at this from a reasonable distance, so you can judge how big this is going to be. You know, this is about 8 centimeters long, so some of these elements are actually quite small, really. So let's do that again. Object, Path, Offset Path. There we go. And if we tab that, yeah, you can see that's actually pretty good. That's going to give us a reasonable gap around the plate that we're going to place into the cut in the surface. And we have to have that gap because the 3D printer, the plastic as it comes out, is extruded. It's a bit like a piping bag when you're making a cake. And the piping is going to squodge out a little bit on its edges, which is going to be slightly bigger than you would expect it to be. And that's in both directions, both on the logo and on the cut. So you really need to expand around it. And I found that the best way to do this was actually to do it in Illustrator. That's why I'm showing you this. So that is now really good. That gives us what we need. And now you can export this as an SVG. So, File, Export, Export As, choose an SVG and save it into the location where you're going to make use of it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go into Fusion and I'm going to show you how you use these shapes to make the 3D logo. Okay, so here we are in Fusion and we have to go to Insert, SVG, and I'm going to load it from my computer. I'm going to go into Rear Branding and there's the Retinot logo. Now originally I actually exported it as two separate objects and I found that in Fusion it's actually better if all the shapes are in one object. And then you have to do a little bit of a dance to kind of get what you want, but it is quite possible to do that. So if we open that, it's going to ask us which plane we want to use. So I'm going to say that. There's our logo. We're just going to finish that. And there you have all the shapes that you need. So for example, if I wanted to extrude the text, we can select all these elements. And I really like this aspect of Fusion when it works. It's really very nice, the workflow. So we're just going to click on that. We're going to push upwards 5 millimeters. There we are. That's fine. And in here, this logo actually isn't to scale. So it's come in, from a bitmap into Adobe Illustrator. So it says that I've extruded by 5 millimeters. That's not true. It's probably more like 1 millimeter, something like that. So when you make this logo, you would then have to scale it to fit it onto the cartridge, which is a process that you go through and it's a bit of a pain. Now, when I did that extrusion, you think you're going to end up with one object, but you're not. You're going to end up with a number of different objects. You can see as I go over these, it highlights them. And I found that there was a really good way of renaming things. It's a little bit hidden, but you basically select a bunch of objects and you go, let's say retro logo. And this is the text, so we're going to call this text. And there we are. It's named all of those. And I'm going to then hide those. We're going to go back down to the shape that we imported, this one here. We're going to make it visible. Every time you extrude something from a shape, it hides it, which is helpful, I guess, most of the time. But sometimes, yeah, it's a little bit of a pain. So next, we're going to grab that. We're going to grab the center of the E as well and the O. That's good. That's all we need. So we're going to go to here. And we're going to go 5 mil again, which, like I said, is actually more like probably 1 mil. There we are. So if we go up here, that's going to be 3 separate objects again. There they are. So we'll do the same thing. Retro logo surround. There we go. I'm going to hide that. Again, back down to the shape. And the last thing we need is the cookie cutter. So for that, the best way I found of doing this is to select the outside shape and extrude that. So let me do that. This one, I'm going to do it a little bit bigger. Let's say 10 or 15 mil. Yeah, that's great. Fantastic. And then I'm going to hide the sketch. And that is actually the opposite of what we need, actually. We need a shape, which is this shape in the center here. So the best way I found to get that shape is to just create a cube, a rectangular cube, whichever way you want to call it, cuboid. And then for that, so what we need to do is we need to say that plane, and I'm going to draw another shape. So just a rectangle. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. There we are. Do that. Finish that. Now I'm going to extrude that upwards slightly. And again, you don't have to be super accurate with this. It's automatically gone into cut mode here, so I need to turn that off. I just want it to be a new body. There we are. Okay, that. And then we're going to look at it from the side. It's a little bit low. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it up a bit. Yeah, click on that. Move it up. Is it still in the middle? Yeah, it is. That's fine. Okay, so once we've done that, I'm going to say I want this. I'm going to select the outside part, and I'm going to use this outside part to cut away from this. And that's going to give us the shape that we need. So we're going to go to Combine, and then you can see you've got Intersect, Cut. Yeah, cut is what we need. You can keep the original tool, this red area. You can keep that if you want it for something else, but in this case, I don't need it. So I'm just going to say OK. And there we are. So that, if we move that down, there we are. And if I now get all these guys and make them visible, it's a bit hard to see that, isn't it? Yeah, so basically what you've got is this is the text in the middle. And then if we have a look in really close, we've got this tool. Let's just select that. Actually, what I've done is I'll put it on top. So let's just move that underneath. There we are. There we go. That's better. Okay, so yeah, we've got the text, all the text elements, we've got our surround, and then we've got this element here, which is, as we saw, probably 0.5 of mil, 0.2 of mil, something like that, bigger than it, which then you can use this to cut into the surface, giving you a place where you can put the logo. And I'll show you what that looks like up here. There's so many objects in here now. Yeah, it's got a lot of stuff. So let me just try and find the objects. These are actually the top logo that we just saw in Photoshop, and I've got our top shape. And if we zoom out, there we are. So yeah, you can see this logo is way too big. You'd have to select all of this and scale it and put it in position here. if we zoom in on here, so yeah, that outer shape would be used to cut an inset like you can see here, which then allows you to actually push that plate into the case. So anyway, hope that gave you a little bit of an insight into how those parts were made. It was an interesting workflow that I had to arrive at, and yeah, I thought I'd just share that with you. So hopefully all of that I've just shown you will have been of interest to you. Obviously, if you're still here, then it probably was. I thought it was a pretty interesting journey. First seeing this on the PCBWay projects page and thinking, wow, it'd be quite cool to have one of those. I set myself a budget, $150, and then I put in the order on the PCBWay projects page. And there was a little bit of toing and froing, mainly because I was trying to work out exactly what I wanted to do, how many boards I wanted to have printed versus how many I wanted to have assembled. In the end, it worked out that, as we said earlier in this video, I could have six boards actually fully assembled, and then I would end up with 5 boards which were spare for other people to use or for myself to use or whatever. This was not a linear path. As with anything worth doing, there was certainly quite a lot of learning along the way. On the table here, I've actually got a few items which show some of the pitfalls that I encountered. Let's come in a little bit closer and I'll just show you those. So yeah, I've got a few more things to show you. These are basically show some of the sort of evolution through printing out this project. I showed you earlier that we have the PETG version of the case. And I originally bought this PETG. It says that it's translucent. I wanted really basically something a bit more transparent rather than translucent. To be fair to Bamboo Labs, it does actually say that on the product, so it's not really their fault. But because I was learning how to use the printer, I didn't want to get tied up in trying to use sort of non-standard bamboo filaments. That's something I thought I would kick down the road a little bit. So the initial prints of this came out looking, I think, really fantastic. The resolution of it is great. This was done at 0.2 with a 0.2 nozzle, 0.2 millimeter, I mean, and 0.1 of a millimeter depth, and it resolves everything fantastically. You can see the slots there, hopefully match up really, really well with the design of the Commodore 64. PETG I found was a little bit stringy, so you get these little filaments of plastic when you finish printing, so that made cleanup a little bit of a pain. And also on here, I had a problem where there was like some supports, and that kind of adhered to here pretty badly, and it really sort of marred the results on there, so I wasn't very happy with that. So later down the line, I did actually change over to trying using a transparent PLA, and that's actually what we've ended up using in the end. One of the first initial prints that I did was a test of just the top part of the case. I think this was a 0.4 millimeter print, maybe 0.2 actually, but it did actually create a raft, and I think it was because of this, a support raft, and that completely adhered to here, and it's basically destroyed the print. So at this point I was a little bit crestfallen, and I thought, oh my God, what have I done here? What have I let myself in for? But you can see the promise on the other side. It shows how incredibly crisp and clean it is. So I knew that if I could get the recipe right for doing the supports, then I would be able to get a really nice print out in the end. So this was a little bit of a disaster, but I did recover from it. I then later on went on to make little tests for the inserts. I was trying to save on waste plastic. Sometimes you do have to do a complete case print to see what you're going to get. To get around that a bit, obviously you can obviously print the top and the bottom separately. You never want to print them both together until you're really happy that you've got a finished result. But this was a test of an insert, and what I discovered was that the insert was a little bit bigger than the original logo, but it wasn't big enough, and I couldn't actually get the logo to sit in it properly. It was kind of popping in and popping out. It didn't want to stay in there. So I persevered with that, and I did a little more test printing, and eventually I got this, which you can see is perfectly inset. There's hardly a gap around it, and that's actually glued in there. But it almost clips into place, as I said earlier. So I was really, really happy with the end result, and I knew then when I did this that I had a solution that would actually work in the end. I then tried printing it using the transparent PLA, and I was having a problem with bed adhesion and warping. And I think it's because this is a different thickness here. Obviously it cuts into the case. So this is thick and then this is thin. And I think the difference in the speed that it was cooling at was causing it to pull off the bed. And I actually had entire top prints of the case that did that, and that was a real pain. And I managed to solve it in the end by using a raft, which would then adhere properly to the base, and that was printed in PETG. And then this part of the case, the main part of the case, was then printed in PLA. Because of that, they didn't stick together. So that was a bit of a breakthrough. So this is one of the first prints where I managed to get that to work. So you can see that it's not actually warped anymore. But I really had to crack this. I think I also put some extra plastic on the back as well. Do you see how that kind of sticks out there? So I did a few revisions of this extra piece of plastic at the back to make it thicker. And eventually I came up with something that worked really well. I think this has got still a little bit of warping on it, but eventually I got that nailed. Here are a couple of the actual insets. You can see what they look like when they're printed and not actually in the case. These are printed at 0.2 millimeter nozzle. The depth doesn't really matter that much, but I think I went with 0.1 of a millimeter for these. There's the Retronaut logo for the back of the case. It's a little bit thicker actually, and it prints out really cleanly because it's larger, so you get this really fantastic looking result, I think. And then here, two tiny little things. We've got the assembled by, let me put that the right way around. There we go. Pretty hard to see because it's quite hard to hold. There we are. So I've got a little tray of these. These are all my little bits and bobs ready to be put into full cases. So I just thought I'd show you those things just so you get an idea of the sort of extra evolution that you have to go through in terms of learning how to print. So yeah, you can see that from what I just showed you. It wasn't a linear path, as I said earlier. Some things had to be overcome. There was a lot of experimentation. But one of the reasons why I set myself this project, designing and making a new case, was as a way of how to learn how to do 3D printing better. I've been really keen on getting a 3D printer for quite a long time. I've been watching it for about 10 years, and I've been slowly watching the technology evolve. And it's got to the point now where it's really, really powerful. Obviously, it's not perfect. There are still some things that can go wrong. Prints can go wrong. As we saw earlier, you can have things like the raft completely adhere to the print and destroy it. That's something which is a bit of an issue. But at the end of the day, I did get what I think is actually a really quite professional looking end result, especially when you consider that it's only my second sort of serious project. The first one was a bracket on my Dell PC, which we looked at recently. Basically, the graphics card had to have its bracket removed, which meant there was nothing holding it in, and I had to design and build a new one. That was relatively simple, but that was my first foray into using Fusion, and I enjoyed it, and I thought Fusion was an interesting piece of software, the way that it worked. This project had a little bit of a different workflow. I used a lot less of the history feature of Fusion, but I did eventually get to the point where, as you saw, I had a fully designed and working case, and I'm really, really happy with the end result. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please make sure you subscribe if you haven't subscribed before, and also hit the bell. That will make sure you get notified about other videos that I produce in the future. And if you could please like the video, that makes a big difference because then other people will be shown the video by YouTube, and hopefully more people will join my channel and it can prosper in the future. Anyway, I think that's quite enough for today. It's quite a long video. So hopefully I'll see you in my next video pretty soon. Until then, take care and have a good day.